Welcome to the party, everyone. Feeling left out is a terrible feeling, even if it's just over something small. Have you ever felt left out? Or uninvited? Maybe there was a party happening and everyone you know got invited except for you. Maybe you thought everyone was laying low one weekend, but then you saw people's Instagram stories and it turns out they were all hanging out without you. It's the worst, right? Anytime we get left out of something, we can't help but immediately start thinking about what we did to not get invited. What are we lacking? What's wrong with us that we're not worth the invitation? Why does it make us feel so bad? I bring this up because I think some of us may feel this way. If you don't, some of your friends might feel this way. Uninvited and unwanted. You might know someone who says, if I show up at church, I'd be struck by lightning. Or if I go to church, the building might fall in. That's a terrible way to feel anywhere, especially church. It doesn't surprise me that people can feel that way sometimes. But why? Because this idea isn't new. The fear of church that people feel is something that religious leaders have been imposing on culture over the last 2,000 years, and it's still making the rounds today. But in Jesus' time on earth, the religious leaders were the ones who were on the inside and got the invites. This was because they were viewed to understand God better than others. They were considered superior to everyone else. To most people in that day and age, it seemed as though God loved them more. If God threw a party, they would be on the A list, and regular people wouldn't make the cut. Basically, they lived with the idea that you must be impressive to be invited. There was a certain type of person you had to be. You had to have a certain type of reputation and lifestyle. People were convinced that only the people who behaved perfectly were welcome in the presence of God. After all, God's guest list only extended to the people who were truly deserving of an invitation. So that's what they taught, that God was only for the holy, noble, good, and worthy. And this meant that a lot of people were left out. Like we said last week, we all tend to believe that some groups of people belong in church and others don't. This idea has been around for a long time. Maybe you have felt like you don't belong. Maybe you're sitting there thinking that if anyone knew what you've been up to, we'd wonder why you're here. Or if I, as a pastor and a professional churchy person, knew what you've been thinking, doing, believing, or doubting, I would tell you that you don't belong. If you've ever felt that way, you're not alone. And there's nothing wrong with you. When I was a teenager, I felt that a lot. I felt like I had to behave to belong, believe to belong, be good to belong. Here's what you need to know. Jesus isn't where that belief comes from. In fact, Jesus made very clear how he felt about this idea. And he did that by telling a story. Last week, we talked about how Jesus was the great storyteller, and he told stories or parables to give people insight into what God is all about. And often the stories took what people already believed and made them think differently. So today we're going to look at a story that he told about who belongs and fits in. And because people had a habit of thinking one way about it, their minds were blown when Jesus interrupted their beliefs and introduced a different way of thinking. The passage begins with Jesus hanging out with some people at a dinner. People were talking, laughing, and telling stories. Jesus told a story about inviting people to a dinner party. And a guy jumped in and basically said, "What a blessing it will be to attend a feast in the kingdom of God." We don't know this for sure, but chances are good that he said this because he assumed that he knew what that type of party would be like. The best of the best would be there. The people who were a big deal. Based on the way the religious leaders saw God, he would only invite the most impressive people. In other words, this guy probably assumed he was invited. But that's not what Jesus had in mind, which is why Jesus immediately began another parable. A certain man was preparing a great banquet and invited many guests. Jesus began, at the time of the banquet, he sent his servants to tell those who had been invited, "Come, for everything is now ready. This is exactly how parables would typically begin, like a normal story. Everything is going as you might think it would. A party was planned, and now it's time for the guest. But this parable, like all parables, had a twist. But they all alike began to make excuses. The first said, "I have just bought a field, and I must go and see it. Please excuse me." The story goes on to give excuses from two other people as to why they wouldn't be at the party. If you're the host of the party and you hear that everyone you invited has more important things to do, it wouldn't go over very well. And that's how the host of this party felt according to Jesus' story. He's angry and aggravated. All this work and no one is going to show? So what's he do? Go out quickly into the streets and the alleys of the town and bring in the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame. To the people listening to the story, this was a major twist. The host didn't reschedule. He didn't send his servant to the first people he invited in hopes of changing their minds. No. The host basically said, if they're not interested in coming, I'm not interested in having them. Go out and find the people who want to be here. And that's what the servant did. In this culture, being poor or sick or disabled often meant being a social outsider. And that's exactly who got invited. He invited all the people no one would expect to be there. And when he was done, the servant said, there's still room for more. So the host sent him back out and told the servant to bring in anyone who wanted to attend. Why? He wanted a full house. He wanted people to be there who wanted to be there. That's the only qualification. Can you imagine what the people at Jesus' table thought when he told this story? So it's not a best dressed party for the impressive in the kingdom of God. It's not exclusively for the best of the best. No, everybody was invited. The only requirement for getting in was showing up. And the people who did show up were blown away. Why? Because no one had ever considered them to be the kind of people to be invited to a party. But in God's kingdom, they are exactly the right kind of people. Not because they had a lot of money, not because they were well behaved, not because their popularity, connections, choices, religion, beliefs, or right choices, but because they wanted to be there. Can you imagine if you were in their position? Think about how they felt. Grateful, honored, special, important, humbled, worthy. They were exactly people who weren't used to feeling accepted with no conditions. But in this story, Jesus was saying that's what the kingdom of God is like. Now, what was Jesus trying to convey with this story? What's the point? At God's party, there's always room for more. Everyone is invited. Everyone can belong. You don't have to be impressive to be invited. You don't have to believe to belong. You don't have to behave to belong. You don't have to be good to belong. God's invitation includes everybody. There's always room for more. This means that you are invited, and so is the person you never expected. You can say yes to the invitation, and you can invite literally anybody else. I hope that changes how you think about church and how you think about the kind of people you thought belonged in church, what they look like, act like, and think like. Because the most surprising thing about this parable is the best part about it. Everyone is invited. If you're not in the party, today I'd like to give you your invitation. No matter who you are or what you've done, you are invited. You belong here. For those of you who are already at the party, I want to challenge you to extend the invitation to others, to people you may have written off or discounted. They are invited as well, and you could be the one to do the inviting. Remember, everyone is invited. This week, I want you to make a list of at least 5 people you know who need to hear this message, that God has extended an invitation for them to belong. If nothing else, I want you to leave here today with a change in the way you think. I want you to start seeing everyone as being invited to the party that God is throwing. Every single person. And next time you start to think that someone doesn't belong or that you don't belong, I want you to remember the story Jesus told and the message behind it. There is always room for more. What if we left here remembering that was true? What if we started to see every person, including ourselves, that way? As someone who was invited to be a part of a party, as someone who only needed to show up, I think it would change the way we see God and the people around us. And it may change the way people see God. Imagine if everyone at your school felt like they belonged in the family of God. Imagine if all your friends felt like they belonged at church. How might it change the way they see God? Remember, in the kingdom of God, everyone is invited, including you, and including everyone you've ever met. Let's leave here remembering that truth.